Welcome back to the Chelsweets kitchen. National Junk Food Day is actually just around the corner. It's on November 16th, and I'm working with Satin Ice to create a pizza cake to celebrate this fantastic holiday. So I have here a massive 10-inch pan that I baked one single layer of cake in, and I've made it with my favorite vanilla layer cake recipe, which I'll include the link to above, and I've used half a batch of that cake batter to make this layer. So we're going to be taking this and hollowing out a little bit of the center to really make it look like a real pizza. We're also going to be making the crust and toppings out of fondant, and of course we'll be making some really delicious marinara sauce with some red buttercream with some strawberry jam. So this cake is going to be just as delicious as it is beautiful, and I'm going to go ahead and zoom in now so you guys can see exactly what we're doing as we build the cake. Before we remove our cake layer, I'm going to take a small offset spatula and just run it around the edge of the pan to make sure that it's really easy for us to get this layer out of our pan. I'm then going to take a cardboard round that is the same size as my cake pan, and I'm just going to flip this over, give it a good tap, and release that. Now that it's out of the pan, I'm going to pull up our parchment round that we used to bake the layer, and I'm just going to carefully flip it onto another round that's the same size. So our first step is going to be taking a 7-inch cake pan, and I'm going to use this to just kind of trim where we want the area of our crust to be. And I'm using a small knife here to do this. So once we have that marked, I'm going to take a spoon and just kind of spoon out a little bit of this cake, because we don't want when we add our toppings for it to kind of bubble over. You also could use a fork to do this. So now if you're worried about it being a little bit too uneven, you can always take a knife and just kind of like trim to get out some of the extra bits that are loose. So next we're going to be making the crust with some Satin Ice fondant, and we're using about 1.5 pounds of fondant to make this. So now that our fondant is warmed up and we're ready to roll it out, I'm going to just sprinkle a little bit of cornstarch onto my board so that our fondant doesn't stick. And now we should be able to work with our fondant really easily. So I'm going to roll this out with my hands, and this doesn't have to be perfect because we do want it to have some texture to really look like a crust of a pizza. So I'm just going to try to keep this somewhat uniformly sized, and when I get to this length I'm actually going to cut it in half, and I'm going to roll out this first portion. I'm going to flatten this a little bit. Alright, so now that we have this bit of crust ready, I'm just going to layer it around the top of the cake. So now it's just time to kind of work it around to make sure that we're covering the entire crust. I'm going to remove any excess where it's overlapping. So now I'm just making sure that it's worked all the way down to the bottom of the cake layer. And I'm just going to give it one good little pinch to make sure that it's nice and secure. So now that our crust is on our cake, it's time to give it a browned look to really look like it's been baked in a pizza oven. So I'm going to use a really fun trick that I learned from Yolanda Gampp on her channel, How to Cake It. When she made her pizza cake, she actually used a blowtorch to caramelize the fondant to give it a really beautiful look. So we're going to do the same thing today, and using the same pan that I used to trace out my layer, I'm going to pop it into the cake just to protect the layers. And I'm now going to use my blowtorch to actually torch the fondant. Once you've caramelized your fondant and it's pretty uniformly dark, be sure to use an oven mitt to remove the pan that you are using, just because it's going to be extremely hot from the blowtorch. The next step is to kind of remove any of these charred bits of cake that might have gotten a little bit toasted while we were caramelizing the crust. So it's important to remove these little bits because otherwise you're going to get kind of a burnt taste, and that is not what you want when you're eating a cake. So now that our crust is ready, we're going to mix some red buttercream here with some strawberry jam. So I've added about a third of a cup of strawberry jam, and as you can see, it really is helping make this look a lot more like a sauce as opposed to some thick buttercream. So I'm now going to add my marinara frosting onto our pizza, and we're just going to gently work it over to where the crust is. We want to make sure we're covering all of our exposed cake here. And as you're doing this, you want to be careful because you don't want to pull up and get a lot of that cake that we've cut into kind of to crumb into the frosting. You want it to be as intact as possible. So we're just being very careful here and only applying enough pressure to just gently move the frosting. Now that our sauce is in place, I'm gonna chill this cake for about 5 minutes so we can add our cheese on top. So now that our cake has chilled in the freezer for about 5 minutes. You can see it's a little bit firmer to the touch. I'm gonna add just a little bit of white buttercream here. And again, this is just some of my classic American buttercream. And we're gonna spread this out, and then we're gonna actually shred some fondant on top of this to really make it look like there's real cheese on it. Using the same technique as before, we're just gonna kind of work the frosting out. Now we're not gonna go all the way to the edge, but we're gonna get pretty close. I'm gonna actually take some fondant that we have from earlier, using a cheese grater. I am just going to actually grate some fondant onto this. And if you wanted to, you could also use modeling chocolate for this. And as you're doing this, just be extremely careful that you don't catch your fingers in the grater. Now that we've got all of our cheese on our pizza, it's time to make the toppings for it. So I've just taken a little bit of fondant here, and using 2 circle cutters, I'm gonna make some little olives. And I'm leaving these pretty thick to make them look like real little bits of olive. So I'm going to start just by cutting out the large circles, and then we're going to remove the center. You could also roll out some black fondant into a nice long cord and just kind of wrap circles out of it, and that's another way you could create olives. So to make my peppers, I'm taking a circle cutter and I'm just going to kind of cut out some half moons. So for our tomatoes, I'm keeping this pretty thick because we want it to look like actual diced tomatoes. And they don't all have to be perfect squares, because in real life, when you dice a tomato, it's obviously a circle, and you do get some other shapes when you are slicing them. So we want this pepperoni to be pretty thin. Just cut out some circles using a 1-inch circle cutter. And we're now going to stick our pepperonis onto our pizza. I actually do want them to have a little bit of curve to them, because when pepperoni bakes, it does kind of naturally curve up, and we want this to look realistic like that. So to give these a little bit of extra color, I'm taking some red gel food coloring. I always like to use Americolor, and I'm adding it 1 drop to some vodka. I'm going to mix these together to give it a little shine. It's time to add the rest of our topping. Next, I'm adding some of the diced tomatoes. I'm also going to brush the green peppers with a little bit of food coloring just to really make them stand out as well. So the finishing touch on our pizza cake is to take a little bit of white chocolate and a microplane and sprinkle some of it over the top to be the Parmesan cheese. So now that our pizza cake is complete, it's time for the best part, to cut in and taste test. It's time to do a little taste test. Let's see, the best part about this cake is that you can eat it literally like a piece of pizza. So let's see. There you guys go. Satin Ice fondant definitely passes my taste test. If you guys enjoyed this tutorial, click the like and subscribe buttons below. And also don't forget to leave what tutorials you'd like to see next in the comments. Thanks so much for stopping by. Hopefully I'll see you guys again soon.